Like this is always the most awkward part.
Yeah, I know. Because I'm always worried that, the internet's not working and stuff
Oh
like
no,
that.
it's going to be great. Hi everybody, as you're coming in.
Cool.
Um, Looks like a good crowd. Excellent. So excited to have Paul Huang with us today, and I think you will all either know him or know why I'm so excited very soon. Let's see. And while we're getting ready, just as a reminder, oh, I see somebody's already figured it out. Um, uh, there's a Q&A button on your screen. If you have any questions for Paul as the hour goes by, feel free to submit them there. We also have the chat function, so you can submit questions there. And without further ado, I think we're going to get going. So here we go. Gorgeous, amazing. For everybody just joining us, we are so fortunate and lucky to have the amazing Paul Huang joining us. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Ben. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping, as we do every mixer. As I was saying before we got to the video, there's a Q&A button for people that you can use on your screen. So if you have any questions at all for Paul about anything, just submit them there and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Feel free to use the chat function. If you want to submit them there, we can see them both places. And yeah, like I said, we'll try to get to as many as we can over the course of the hour. I do want to thank, we have some partnering restaurants that have offered some special deals for those of us tuning in for these. They are the Hendrix Restaurant and Bar in Laguna Niguel, Toast Kitchen and Bakery in Costa Mesa, Provenance in Newport Beach, Haven Craft Kitchen and Bar in Orange, Descanso Restaurant in Costa Mesa, and Adya in Irvine. So definitely check them out and mention Pacific Symphony and our mixer series, and you can get some special deals on those. So, like I said, I'm super, super excited and honored to have Paul here. A little brief rundown of his very, very impressive and extensive biography. Among his many achievements, Paul was the recipient of the 2015 Avery Fisher Career Grant, which, as many of you may know, is a huge milestone for classical musicians. Also, the Lincoln Center Award for Emerging Artists. He won the Young Concert Artist Auditions, which have launched many soloist careers. He's also affiliated with Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, and right in our sort of backyard, Camerata Pacifica up the coast in Santa Barbara. He's won prizes in just like literally so many competitions. It's mind-blowing, including the Timur Varga International Violin Competition, the Chimay Cultural Foundation Arts Awards for Taiwan's Most Promising Young Artists, the Salon de Virtuosi Career Grant, and the Classical Recording Foundation Young Artist Award. So if that doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will for this hour. So Paul, again, thanks so much for being here. I'm trying to remember the first time, at least I played with you with Pacific. Have you played with Pacific, what, twice now?
Yes, I think twice.
And I think once was a, oh, there's my dog. I think once was a summer concert. Was that Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto?
Yes, it was
yeah, and I remember you playing, and I was just like, wow, he is amazing. And we were all really excited for you to come back a season or two ago and play the Brook Violin Concerto inside, not for an outdoor summer concert on our classic series, which is what we just saw a clip of. So obviously, like, you know, great relationship with Pacific Symphony, and I hope you'll be back many, many more times once we're playing again. So I've always been really curious, you know, for somebody who spends so much, like you spend so much of your time going around playing concertos with orchestras and going around doing chamber music all over the world. Like, do you have a home base where you swear, like,
I do
not
actually. Yes, actually, I if I'm not traveling, I'm actually situated in New York City. That's where I call home. Well, at least I consider where I do my laundry. So I think that's considered home. So yeah, I have been living in New York since I was about 13.
Wow.
And before that, I was living in Taiwan, which is where I was born. So I came to New York to study at Juilliard Pre-College when I was 13, and I have been living in New York since then.
Oh, that's great. And so when you're not in New York, obviously you're doing a lot of traveling. How much of the year would you say you're traveling versus actually getting to stay at home?
I think every season usually depends. There are some bigger seasons and smaller seasons. Usually they alternate somehow. It works out with me that way. And I would say that I would be home about like a week and a half every month. So so I think that's a pretty good amount of time. And I try my best to not go on the road too long. And I like to come back, you know, to some housekeeping things at homes, and also you know, also for the fact that I do need to rehair my bow every few months. So coming back to New York is important to me, and getting my instrument checked up, and I think it's healthier that way, and I like that kind of schedule.
Yeah, I imagine it would be hard to have a pet though, if you're home a week and a half a month.
You know, I'm very envious that you have a dog, because that's what I really would like to have. But I think it's a little unfair for the dog at the moment. If I were to have one, because I would be not home often enough.
Or you need a dog that can just travel everywhere.
Yeah. But I like big dogs, so it's not gonna work at the moment.
So would you say that like when you're home in New York, is that when you get a lot, like the bulk of your practicing done, or do you try to really incorporate that into your travel schedule also?
I think it's a little bit of both. Um, I do look forward to my schedules maybe 6 months out, and then try to plan them ahead, and and inevitably I would have to do a lot of the practicing on the road as well. But I know that I'm less efficient when I'm on the road in terms of practicing, just because that there are places that I would like to go, and if
Yeah.
I'm visiting a new town for the first time, of course you wanted to allocate some time for that as well. So I would say it is true that I would spend more time practicing at home than I would be on the road.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I guess another thing I've always been curious about uh, for people who spend their lives going around, playing concertos, how many concertos would you say you have in your repertoire at any given time that you could pull out and play with an orchestra? Or like, do you plan like the whole season ahead of time to know what you have to have? Like, how does that work?
Um, Actually, so usually for our schedule, usually it's planned about 2 seasons ahead of time with orchestras in the US or in Europe. I think it's usually 2 weeks out, 2 years out.
Yeah.
In the Far East, it's a little bit shorter time. Just the way they do things are much shorter time. So I would get noticed maybe a season ahead of time. But I I don't know. I think I would play maybe like 12 to 15 concertos that I feel comfortable pulling at any given time.
Wow.
And then of course there are cancellations, and a lot of um, situations is when I get calls for cancellations, and especially for young artists like myself. Those cancellations are important for me, and so if it's a repertoire that you don't know as well, and then you would of course you would ask like when is the concert, and then you would try to see if you are able to um, fit that in with your schedules. And there has
Yeah.
been some of the cases in my career so far, and then some of them I locked out repertoire wise that I feel comfortable playing in 2 weeks time or in 2 days time. And there are repertoires where I learned it when I was younger, but I will have to pick up very quickly. And
Yeah.
and so I think allocating time for yourself is extremely crucial for traveling musicians. Dividing your time is and do it wisely and do it very efficiently is something that I always learn almost every other day. I was like, oh, I could do this better, I could do that better. So it's a
Yeah.
constant improvement.
And could you explain for everybody what you mean when you say cancellations and how that works?
Well, cancellation means that any given soloist may have to pull out of a engagement on the very last minute, whether it's sick, illness, or couldn't make it on time. I've stepped in for situations where the soloist cannot make it on time for the first concert, and or pregnant, or birth of a first child. I mean, all sorts of reasons, and that's when management around the world or in the U.S. would get calls for last minute substitutions, and who is available and who can play the repertoire. And so usually there is a list of people to call, and of course you also want to, or presenter wise, I think they would have to want to feel like they're comfortable enough to hire X person, whether they have heard of him or her, or whether they have had a history with the orchestra before, or they have had good recommendations from a trusted musicians, conductors, artistic administrator, so on and so forth. So it's a lot of puzzles to put together in a very short time, and frankly, it's who can play the repertoire and who is available at that time. So that narrows down a lot of things.
And well, going back to repertoire for a second, I'm just still so impressed. Like if you have, 15 or 16 concertos that you feel like you could just sort of pull out and play, like, do you have specific methods for having so much music memorized at a given time? Or is it just something that you've done for so long that it's just sort of there?
Regarding memorizations, I think a lot of repertoire when I learned when I was much younger, when I was in school, in pre-college or in early years, I think they tend to stick with you much longer for some reasons. Someone has to investigate on that, but I always feel that the repertoire that I have not played for a long time, and when I was learning and when I was a young kid, it tends to come back very quickly. Just somehow, the hands just remembers the notes. Maybe it's not perfect, but at least what's the next note. And as you get older, I think it doesn't stick as quick as you would like them to. And also I have a kind of like a Xerox book where I would just kind of Xerox a few pages of a concerto where I find they're more troublesome or tricky, and I would Xerox them in like a binder. So let's say there would be like 3 or 4 pages of Tchaikovsky concertos, or 4 pages of the Walton concerto and Szymanowski concertos. It's like, so I would, come back to it kind of like a warm up, if you will, every day. So I would just go through them because it doesn't take a long time to go through them. If there are sections, it's kind of a little bit like excerpts for orchestra musicians. You play excerpts in here and there, and then and it's always there because you treat them as like a practicing exercises. So those things tend to
that's an interesting idea. Yeah, that's fascinating. And of the concertos that you've sort of taken around and played with various orchestras, do you have a favorite one that you just sort of always get excited when you get to play it?
Oh, that's a hard one because I love a lot of them. And, I think the great thing about us being musicians is that, we can love a piece any other night. And, the next night I would love another concerto, So I think that's a great advantage for us. But, I would say if I were to pick a concerto that I would always love to come back to it, it would probably have to be the Brahms concerto. Somehow I just find that concerto to be the most perfect concerto for the violin, very well suited for the instrument, and it has a huge range of emotions, and it highlights the qualities of the violin, which is the singing quality and also the virtuosity and the depth of the sound that a violin can produce. And so I don't know, I just like that concerto a lot.
Well, our principal violist Meredith Crawford, who's here, says great choice. She agrees with you. Are there any concertos that you haven't gotten to perform with orchestra yet that you would sort of like really be itching to try?
Yes, actually, I have not done the Shostakovich concerto. And that's actually on my agenda for the season after next year, and I'm greatly looking forward to. I'm already studying the concerto, and then I'm looking very much forward to kind of delve into that Russian repertoire. And I've sort of shied away with that piece when I was a student, and I actually never learned it when I was a student for whatever reason. I don't know why. And but it's really, really a powerful concerto, and
I love it, and a great flute part, so it must be good.
Yes.
Well, I'll go ahead and say bring it to Pacific anytime. You're hired. So when you're actually doing like the nitty-gritty of traveling and going, if you're flying to Europe or flying from the East Coast to the West Coast, I imagine, like, does jet lag play into sort of, you know, you're doing such a difficult task already. Like, how do you deal with things like jet lag, or, you know, if you're playing obviously in many new halls that may be unfamiliar? Um, do you have sort of a routine that helps you feel more comfortable going to unfamiliar places?
I, I I'm lucky enough that I actually sleep pretty well on the plane, so hasn't been a big trouble for me yet, knock on wood. And I find it exercising on the road helps as well, especially when you have to wake up, well, because of the jet lag, that you wake up super early or super late, you know, depending on the time zone. But you know, actually, I got this kind of questions pretty often, saying that, you know, it's a pretty difficult task for a soloist to go from city to city, and then, you know, to play in, you know, meaty repertoire all the time. But, you know, I actually have to say that, actually, compared to your job or to many other people's job, actually mine is not so bad after all, because, you know, we only need to spend 2 hours in a concert hall a day, and then the rest of the day is free. You know, very often, like, you know, my parents would call and say, "Oh, what you doing today?" I said, "Well, I have a rehearsal." And then she said, "Oh, that's it? It's only 2 hours a day, and then the rest, like, you're free, because, you know, you basically rehearse for 2 hours, and then the rest of the day is you know, it's all yours." And as opposed to if you're in New York or if you're at home, then you have a lot of other things to do. And
Yeah.
so I actually always find that very interesting comparison. But I do love traveling a lot, and I especially love meeting people when I'm on the road, and getting to know places and getting to know orchestras and halls. So it's always been a pleasure for me. So I don't find it very, very tiring.
Yeah, that's amazing. And once you get to a given, like, let's say you're showing up for a week of rehearsals and concerts with an orchestra, um, how much time do you generally have to spend with the conductor ahead, like before everything even starts, just to sort of get everything figured out, and sort of what things are discussed in those meetings?
Um, I think depends on the repertoire. If you were to talk about a very familiar repertoire, let's say the Bruch Concerto, which I did with your orchestra and Maestro Sinclair, the meeting with him was very quick, straightforward, and of course, during that time, you sort of detect what the style and what kind of sort of a timing and flavor a conductor wants to impose on the repertoire, and also vice versa. And genuinely, I think those situations are much easier, because it's a very familiar repertoire, unless you're doing something really, really outrageously different from what other people are doing, which is possible.
Yeah.
But I remember my meeting with Maestro Sinclair with the Bruch Concerto was very, very quick, and very symbiotic, if you will, because just from his hand gestures and those timings that he was, you know, singing out loud with me playing for him, I know exactly how the rehearsals will go, and very often those meetings were all about talking about the timings of the repertoire, about the concertos, and timing plays an incredibly important role in a success of a performance. And
Yeah.
whether the conductor is one second ahead of you or 1 second behind you. You know, for instance, I remember very fondly the Tchaikovsky concerto that I did with all of you, and at the outdoor, beautiful, gorgeous amphitheater. And you know, the out of my cadenza in the very first movement, which comes in the beautiful flute solo, where I'm kind of just trilling on top of it. And as simple as it may seem, you know, that I'm just trilling, waiting for the flute to come in, but the timing of the entrance of the flute is extremely important, of setting up the mood of that recapitulation. And somehow, actually, I feel like it's one of the most difficult timing that conductors get. And then I remember that was a very, very beautiful timing and very, very blissful experience of that whole, that kind of return. And it I've always known that Maestro Sinclair has incredible timings with the soloist and also with him conducting symphony orchestra as well. So it's always very pleasurable.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those interesting things too, where a lot of times if the job is done well with the timing, it's something that you notice it if it's not right, but it should just sound completely natural and like make a great case for like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be.
Yes, exactly. It's like kind of like playing Mozart. When it sounds right, it sounds very easy, but when it sounds wrong, it's so obvious.
Yeah. And speaking of Mozart, we actually have a really beautiful clip of you playing the fourth, a clip from the fourth Mozart violin concerto. Can you tell us a little background about this performance?
Sure. So this was a performance from actually a step in, actually a last minute replacement at the Bravo Bell Festival in Colorado. Where the violinist who was scheduled to perform on Sophie Mutter actually couldn't make it to the first concert for the opening night of the festival. So it was a very, very last minute call came my way to fly out to Colorado to play this Mozart 4 with the chamber orchestra of Vienna, Berlin. The chamber orchestra consists of principal players from the Vienna Philharmonic and the Berlin Philharmonic. And they only tours in the summer times when they have breaks from the orchestras. And it's an immensely pleasurable play with all of them, especially without conductor. And and Mozart is definitely their bread and butter, and you can hear that from the sound that they produce. And I should note that this concert almost got canceled when I got there because it was snowing in June in Colorado.
Oh, wow.
One of those very weird weather, in the histories of the festival, they've never had an opening night that was snowed. And so in the clip, you might notice that there are 4 gigantic tubes on the floor. Those were heaters.
Oh,
so
wow.
They're pumping heat to us, and and I don't know how the wind players survived in the concert because you have cold air breathing, because it's an amphitheater as well, so you have cold winds coming your way, and then you have heater underneath, and it's an experience. But it was
I have no idea how anybody would stay in tune.
Yes.
Great. Well, let's take a listen to this clip and a look, and see you back in a minute. Gorgeous, amazing.
Thank you.
Really, really beautiful Mozart. So, you mentioned, and we just saw that you were obviously not just the soloist there, but also basically leading the ensemble. How often would you say you do that?
Not often enough. I really cherish the opportunity to work with musicians from orchestra in this kind of directness and kind of molding an interpretation together collectively. But it takes an incredible discipline among musicians and also the soloists, and it could be a disaster actually when it's not done right. And so I cherish opportunities like this, but I'm also very careful in picking the right situations to do such a thing like this. And because I find it that it's such a rare opportunity, one has to really use it for the full potential. And when it's done well, and it's kind of like playing chamber music with a bigger ensemble, and that's what music should be.
Yeah, totally agree. We have a question from Elizabeth Moulton who wants to know how much rehearsal time for this particular performance did you have with the musicians before performing?
I had one rehearsal,
Wow.
and then one sound check on the morning of the concert, because we wanted to kind of check out the stage, because in the morning was kind of snowing, and we wanted to just get our instrument kind of in the temperature, and of course, actually more importantly, is for them to set up the heater on stage, and because they've never done that in the history of the festival, so they had to overnight ship in heater pumping on stage. And at one point they were almost considering building another tent on stage, so
Wow.
tent within the tent.
Just for heating purposes?
But yeah, just to keep it warm.
Wow.
But somehow it worked out. I guess it's the adrenaline. And I had those heating pads where you put I don't know what you call those little square thing, the heat pad.
Yeah.
It's kind of like some little rocks in there. So I put like 5 of them in my pocket. And then so when I'm not playing, so I would stick one of my hands in the pocket, waiting for my entrance, and I'll put my hands up again and start playing.
It's a good idea. I mean, but talk about a performance with so much, like, you're basically coming in sort of last minute, as you mentioned, for Anne-Sophie Mutter, and having to basically conduct the piece as well as play it, and dealing with snow and cold. Like, wow, it's amazing. And we have another question while we're at it from Yutong Sharp, who's a friend of mine and a violinist in Pacific Symphony, who says, fantastic playing. And she wonders if you would mind sharing your practice routine. She also sort of preempted my question from later in the hour, which is if you're practicing more or less now during this sort of downtime with the pandemic.
Practicing procedures as in general, or for this particular concert? In general, okay.
I must, well, every day, she says.
Okay. Generally, I think it's pretty basic, actually, kind of like housekeeping things. I start with scales and arpeggios and double stops for sure, meaning playing 2 notes at once. And very often I actually find myself playing open strings for a few minutes just to get the instrument ready to go. And after that, I one of my joy of practicing is to make up exercises myself as I go. And depending on what I'm working on and what I feel like I was lacking at the time, and it could be a right hand thing, it could be a left hand thing, it could be an intonation thing, it could be a string crossing thing, and I would try to make up exercises to cater for the obstacles that I was trying to deal with for the repertoire that I was working on. And then I generally don't practice more than 3 hours a day. I just find myself not concentrating afterwards. So I would say 3 hours is my maximum a day. And if needed it to be, then I would break down and then add another hour and a half or two later in the day. But I kind of try to like to practice in the morning and be done with musical things by 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, because we all have a life to live too. So
That sounds nice.
practicing is not not the only thing that we do in life. So so yeah, I think it's pretty basic, and but what is important is the exercises, because I think that's so important, and it prevents injuries. And I think injuries is something that all of us are all very careful about, and we should always be careful at all times, because once you have one injury, it sort of stay with you, whether you heal or not. It somehow always stay with you, as you get older. So that's something that I try to be very careful.
Yeah, I think that's very smart. And like you said, something we all deal with sort of as what we do is so physical. It's like, yeah.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned in terms of this Mozart performance, how it was sort of fun because it was almost like sort of expanded chamber music in a way, especially without a conductor and with that group of musicians in particular. And, another thing that sort of has struck me about your career is that you seem to spend a lot of your time not just going around playing as a soloist with orchestras, but you've invested a lot of time into chamber music projects and chamber music organizations. I mentioned a few of them at the top of the hour. So have you always been like sort of equally interested in chamber music, more or less? What draws you to it?
I'll tell you a story actually. So my love for chamber music was starting very, very early on when I was a kid. The most memorable thing that I would remember would be with my violin teacher, actually, my first violin teacher when I was studying in Taiwan. And of course, as a kid, you always want rewards when you do something right. When you did your homework right, and then when you come back next week, the teacher examines, the piece, and then you play well or whatnot. And the reward for me, if I did something right and if I did well, would be that I get to play with my teacher a violin duet. We have like a book of violin duets that we would play together, and we would go from the first piece to the last piece, and that would be sort of our rewards. And then I just cherish that so much, because not only I get to hear a beautiful sound from my teacher that I always try to emulate, but also just the idea of communicating through music. And that's always something that I always remember very fondly. And that was chamber music, that was the beginning of my chamber music life. And I've always loved chamber music. And for me, chamber music is the pinnacle of any form of music making. Playing concerto is chamber music. Even playing solo Bach, for me, it's playing chamber music, because you have to balance different voices and whatnot. And so I feel like I learn most when I play chamber music, and I learn from the best people when I play with the great artists. And I feel like that's like the quickest way for me to be better and then to learn. And so I always cherish opportunities to play chamber music with people that I admire. And so naturally that I will have a lot of people that I would like to play with, and that gives me opportunities every season to play with some of my very favorite artists. And so happen that many of them all are artist members with either the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center or in the West Coast with Camerata Pacifica in Santa Barbara. So I divide my time for these two organizations exclusively, actually, where I would do most of my chamber music playing throughout the season. And in the summertime, of course, in the festival circuit, it's a different story. But I feel lucky that I have a management team that understands my passion and who believe in me in this endeavor, because it's not always that an agency would let an artist to play the kind of chamber music that I play with that many dates every year,
Yeah.
because naturally they for them the most profitable is for me to go play concertos, and playing chamber music is less profitable naturally. But for me, that's you know, I try to think of for a little bit longer trajectories of my career, and so I am very grateful that I have a team who understand that part and would divide my concerto, my recitals, and my chamber music dates in a ratio that I feel comfortable with. So I feel lucky.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's not something I would have thought of, like sort of the management side of how you would divide that up and the finances of it. It's really interesting. How much so, you know, obviously, since we're out here in the West Coast, a lot of us are curious about, like, can you tell us a little bit about Camerata Pacifica and like how it, you know, if there were no pandemic, like how many weeks would you typically come out to play chamber music in Santa Barbara?
Well, Camerata Pacifica is a very, very unique organization. It's like a family for me, actually. It has a very small roster of musicians, and we would come out depending on the programs, of course. So basically, Camerata Pacifica hosts a series of 4 concerts a month, and they would tour around Santa Barbara, LA, and San Marino at the Huntington Library, and also in Ventura at the museum. So each program gets to repeat 4 times. So that's a very, very unique setup for us to get to play chamber music with colleagues 4 times. And in a normal circumstance, also depending on my schedules lineup, I would do about 2 or 3 programs with them. So that means that it will come out for each program will consist of 2 weeks, including rehearsals and the tour dates. So it would be about like a month and a half of a season that I would play with Camerata Pacifica. And you know, I get any excuse I can to come to California because I just love it so much. And it almost is almost I feel lazy when I come to California because the weather is so nice and you get to go to beaches, and I find myself very lazy when I'm in California. But those
Yeah,
are
I
good
think
excuses to come.
we feel very lucky to be here. Well, once things get back to normal, it'll be great to keep track of, you know, I'm sure a lot of people from the Pacific Symphony family would love to come up, you know, either to LA or Santa Barbara and get to see you in one of those concerts. And I know I've played with Camerata Pacifica a number of times, but you and I have unfortunately never overlapped. So hopefully that'll happen sometime in the future.
I know. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So we've had a lot of questions about your violin, and let's see if I can find any of the specific ones. But basically, like Ildiko Good wants to know what violin you play on. We've had a few questions about that. And I'm wondering, can you just tell us a little bit about the story about it? It sounds actually really fascinating when I was reading up on it.
Sure. So the violin that I currently play on is on loan to me from a foundation in Chicago called the Stradivari Society. A little bit of the society background is that was founded by a philanthropist. At the time, the violinist Midori, she was maybe around 8 years old or 9 years old. She was about to make her debut with the New York Philharmonic, and her teacher, Miss DeLay, Dorothy DeLay, requested that she needed a better violin to play with an orchestra, and so this philanthropist ended up loaning her a wonderful Del Jesus, Giuseppe Guarneri Del Jesus, for her debut. And then that was the start of this society where their mission is to pair great instruments, specifically Stradivari violins and Guarneri Del Jesus violins, to young soloists who have the potentials to become successful in their early career, where they are not able to afford such instruments like this caliber. And so I became their recipient actually twice. Actually, once was 10 years ago or 12 years ago, and then the most recent one was the one that I currently play on. It's now 6 years or 7 years now, and it's a wonderful violin by the Italian maker Giuseppe Guarneri da Jesus. It was made in 1742. It's one of his very last violins that he made, and this violin has a particular history because this violin was the concert violin for a great Polish composer, violinist, Henry Wieniawski. So this was the violin that he played on for much of his career, actually. And so, you know, he was famous for his two violin concertos, the F sharp minor and the D minor violin concerto, which I think people still play these days. And it's pretty astonishing to think of that the violin sound was what he had in mind when he was composing these two great concertos, and also among other concert pieces. And so it's really a living art, and every day I open the case, it's a very special feeling. And you know, we're just temporary custodian to this kind of history pieces, and it will live much longer than all of us will ever be.
Well, I imagine there must be such a just sort of the weight of that history, knowing, you know, where that violin has been, and, you know, obviously who has played on it. That's really incredible. Have you gotten to perform either of the Wieniawski concertos on it?
Yes, actually, I've done the D minor concertos a number of times, and but of course, you know, if I were to put this out there very often, it becomes like a programmatic thing, because the idea that I play on the Wieniawski violins, and I don't want it to feel like that I played Wieniawski so often throughout the season. I want to play other pieces as well. So it's just a little balance there.
And when you talked about how it's on loan to you from this foundation, when you are going to get an instrument, how do you go about choosing what instrument is right for you? And do you get much choice when you're going through a foundation like that? Like, how does the pairing process work?
Great questions. We have absolutely no say about it, because there are so few instruments out there. So either you get it and then you're lucky enough to play on it, and of course there is always the pairing question, whether it suits you or not. And actually, notoriously, this instrument is actually not very easy to play on. Actually, there were a number of people before me who were offered this violin and ended up turning it down and then giving it back because they couldn't play on it. So there are cases like that, but luckily for me, somehow this violin suits me very, very well. And there was actually a very interesting story behind this violin with me personally, actually, because I first met this instrument when I was 15. And at the time, I was just about to make my very first recital debut in Europe, in Paris, at the Louvre Museum. And at the time, my teacher thought that I really needed a better violin for a relatively important engagement in Europe. And so he made a few phone calls, and one of them being this foundation, and asked if he were, they would be willing to loan me a violin just for 1 month, just for the concert. And knowing that because I'm so young, and they have insurance concerns, and having me, a 16-year-old kid carrying such an expensive violin to Europe, why not? But luckily they agreed to it, and so I got to play on this particular violin, which was at the time was available for that month. So I made my debut in Europe with this violin, and then I came back and then returned it, and thought that I would never see this violin ever again. Move on to my little life. But and then of course, throughout the course of my career, there are a few wonderful instruments came to my possessions. And then the one before this current one was from a foundation in Taiwan, actually. It was a Stradivarius violin, and then they needed it to me to return the violin on a relatively short notice. And so I was almost left with no violin. And one day, actually, I was in Camerata. Actually, I was in California. I received a phone call from an unknown number from Chicago, and I decided to pick it up. And it was the director from the foundation, whom I have not spoken in years, since I was 16. And she says, "Oh, I hope you still remember me. And then, we understand that we heard from people that you are in need of an instrument." And I don't know where they heard that from. I didn't really tell anybody except my manager. And then she says, "Oh, we have an instrument somehow to be available right now. Would you like to come to Chicago to try?" So I booked the next flight next day to Chicago, and then it was this very same violin sitting there. And
Wow.
After 7-8 years later, it was the same violin that was available again. So it has a pretty beautiful story, and I feel like it's a kind of a full circle for me.
Yeah, that's amazing. What a cool story for the violin itself, but also just your relationship with the violin. That's amazing. So, speaking of like old masters like Wieniawski, we actually had a question from our assistant concertmaster, Jeannie Scrocky. Hi, Jeannie. She said that you have such a gorgeous sound. It reminds her of many of the old masters, especially when you perform pieces like by Chrysler and short concert pieces. And she wants to know if there are any particular violinists that you try or have tried to emulate in terms of your sound and approach.
Oh, that's very sweet, Jeannie. Thank you very much. It means a lot to me, actually. I have a lot of favorite violinists that I listen to constantly, and then they are mostly old masters, meaning people who are dead. And I think one of them that comes to mind is the young Menuhin. I really love Menuhin's sound, especially the recordings that when he was very young, before 18 actually. And then people like Tasha Seidel, and of course I listen to Heifetz a lot, and of course Chrysler. Who doesn't like Chrysler? And there are a few actually master violinists that actually somehow a little bit forgotten, that I just wish that people know more about them actually, and then probably because they left such little recordings. And people like Philip Hirschhorn, the list goes on. Jeanette Wood, a lot of people in those eras. I think they all possess such an individual sound, and there's always something that you can trace from their lineage. And I always learn so much from listening to their recordings, and
yeah,
they are inspirations to me. They are truly inspirations to me.
Yeah, well, and as Jeannie says, she can hear all of those in your sound. And I mean, it is a gorgeous sound. It's amazing. So I wanted to spend a little time just talking about, obviously, concert life has been completely disrupted in the last, 5 or 6 months. And there are no concerts, at least live ones, sort of, mostly. And so I'm assuming you have not been traveling as much. And I'm just wondering, how have you spent your time? As I think we sort of touched on earlier, like, are you finding that you're practicing sort of the same, more, less, like without having specific projects on the horizon, maybe?
When the pandemic first hit, it was in mid-March. I was actually in Tucson. I went to Tucson for the engagement with the orchestra there, and I did the rehearsals, but I knew the concert was not going to happen. There was absolutely no way the concert was going to happen. In fact, actually, I booked a flight on the concert day that I was ready to come back. I was just waiting for the management to tell me that the concert is canceled, and it did turn out to cancel. And that was the last trip that I made. And and for a month, I was actually quite depressed, actually, because there was no deadline. There was nothing that I can work towards to, and there was no goal actually, and I miss packing up. My life has always been about on the move and packing, unpacking, hitting airports, getting checked in and things like that, and something that I'm not used to it, being home all the time, and I've been living in this same apartment since I first moved to New York when I was 14, and
Oh,
it's
wow.
been long overdue for a major renovation. So one day, I finally decided that I'm just gonna clean up the whole apartment, and I'm gonna repaint it, the whole thing. I'm gonna get rid of all the old furniture. I'm gonna start over again. So that was a big project for me, and which kept me sort of lively, if you will. And then there are when things started to take shape, when people are starting to understand how to do more of the virtual aspects of the events online and things like that. So I was lucky enough that there were quite a number of organizations who reached out to me, like Pacific Symphony, reached out to me for engagements through Zoom or through different platforms, engaging their audience, their patrons, and so that was actually a wonderful project for me as well. And then I did a few of this online performances, one of them being called Music Never Sleep NYC. It's a 24-hour marathon that was hosted by my dear friend cellist Jan Fogler, who got together all the musicians from New York, people like Gil Shaham, Adele, Orly Shaham, some of our friends, Ben Bioman, all these wonderful musicians in New York City to contribute a segment of program. And so it runs for 24 hours. And so that was fun. And I've also done a few, kind of a backyard concert for Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, and keeping busy, learning new repertoire actually, because I feel like, oh, this is maybe the right time to, learn pieces that I don't have time to learn and don't necessarily have to program it, but just learning for the sake of learning.
Yeah.
But in the coming months, actually, I'm greatly looking forward to going back to my country, Taiwan, where I'm the artist in residence with the National Symphony, with concerts coming up in November and December, actually.
Oh, wow.
And Taiwan has been doing very well with virus, and so the life is completely back to normal actually in Taiwan. Concert halls are completely full.
That's amazing.
No distancing needed. So that's my chances of playing concerts, and I feel very grateful for that. And somehow lucked out that I'm the artist in residence with the orchestra this coming season means that I get to go a few times a year, and get to play concertos and also chamber music and also recitals
Wow,
presented by the orchestra. So
that's amazing. I
that's
feel like
something
all
that I
other
look forward
musicians,
to.
sorry, I feel like all musicians are going to be very envious of you getting to actually perform during this time.
There is hope. There is hope everywhere. So if we all do our job, I think we'll get through this. But, it takes discipline.
And we also have another clip that I want to share at the end, something you've made during the quarantine, and we'll get to that, the Jamaican rumba. But before we do, if you don't mind, we're basically at 6 o'clock, but if you have a couple minutes, we do have a few questions, if you don't mind.
Of course.
People are very curious, which is great. So let's see. Rosalind Britton would like to know, how often do you check in with a teacher to tune up skills, get advice, general rejuvenation? Do you tend to go back to your old teachers and sort of do those things?
You know, as I mentioned, I think nowadays I get more inspiration and more new ideas actually through colleagues, actually through playing chamber music. And when I hear something that I don't know how to produce, I tend to get very curious and I tend to drill my colleagues and how did you do that? You know, and then, or I would observe, you know, obsessively to see, you know, how did he or she do it, and you know, what was the mechanic behind it or emotionally behind it, and things like that. So I feel like that's like my best learning tools these days, and I grab that chance very, very, you know, willingly and then very often.
Yeah.
That's why I play chamber music a lot, and that's where I learn the most.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to be. Gladys would like to know if you have any plans to put out a new album.
I have actually a few ideas in terms of the album repertoire, but with album it's a tricky situation actually because of the industry. It's been quite different in the last few years, and putting up an album is not as on one side it's very easy because there are a lot of self-produced albums, and on the other side it's also very tricky getting record label to agree to your repertoire. And so there's a much more of a back and forth of discussions about what to record, probably more than ever. And so it's a tricky situation. So I waiting for the right time. Actually, there are two record companies that we are in discussions of certain repertoires that I would like to record, but it will probably take time for them to become fruitful in finding the right partners and finding the right ensembles to play with. It will take a little bit of time, and but you know, this in this digital world, there are so many different outlets of putting your work out there. You know, like YouTube or releasing single tracks, things like that. And but for record labels, for them to, in the financial side of being feasible and able to make a profit for the company, it's a whole different ball game of, you know, becoming having two ideas come in one. It's not always very easy.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a lot of moving parts, and especially with Spotify and all the streaming now, it's like totally different.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Fiona. She said, you know, we were talking about concert dates, and you mentioned, you know, your management agency, and she wants to know, in general, do you get a lot of say in selecting the events that you do, or does the management agency sort of organize all of that for you, or is it sort of a mix?
It's at the end, I always have the final approval of whether I want to play or not. But it's always in very much a discussion between two parties. But yes, I would say I would have most of the say of whether I want to do it or not. And most of the time I do it very willingly because I love playing music and that's my life.
Yeah. So. Let's see. We have a question from Bill Beck, who wants to know, when starting to learn the violin, do you have a preference, or do you have an opinion, what's most important, bowing, technique, or intonation?
Oh, that's a great question. I think they're all very important. But I will say, you know, when you are starting out as a young musician, or, you know, when you're learning to play the violin, I find that I learned it myself, that, you know, one has to concentrate on one thing at a time. You know, very often it's, for me, it's interpretation and technique. They are kind of the two pillars of your improvement, you know. And then it's very hard to go two things at the same time to be better at the same time. So you would work on technique, and the technique got better. Then you start to realize that, oh, then this other thing needs to get better in order to feed off of your technique. And once the things reach that there, it says, oh, because well, my technique's not great enough to imagine what I want to do, interpretation wise, then the technique gets, hopefully get better again. So it's kind of like, it's always this kind of pillars of improvement. I don't know. I've never seen anyone who improves both things at the same time. Certainly not me. So I think they are all very important, but they come also, just to say that they come hand in hand, because one feeds off of each other.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I like that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Well, we are 6 minutes over. I want to leave everybody with this awesome clip of Paul, the Jamaican rumba. Paul, could you give us a little background about how this project came about, or a little about this piece?
Sure. So this project came about of, purely out of my boredom during the COVID time. And we had scheduled, my piano partner Helen Huang, we had scheduled to tour the US actually in May, and also in the Far East in June. And since nothing could have come to realization, and I miss playing with her. She lives in New Jersey, and I live in New York, and we hardly see each other because she has family, she has kids. Of course, you don't want her to make any risk. And so one day I was like, why don't we pick up some of our favorite encore pieces and pick pieces that we can put together virtually, because how this video was made, I mean, to now it's not very secret anymore, because everyone got so advanced with technology through this COVID time. Everyone knows exactly what to do, everything now. It's that either I play first and then she would play on top of it. Basically, I record first and then she would play to my recording, or she would play first and then I would play to her recording, depending on the repertoire, who has more of the constant beats. Yeah. And so Jamaican rumba is one of our all-time favorite encore pieces that we love to play after our recital programs. And it's just very, very fun. And for those of you who don't know about the piece, it's actually by an Australian composer, Walter Benjamin. And this is probably his most famous piece, actually. And it was so famous that the Jamaican government, in order to thank him for making Jamaica so popular around the world, that the government sent him a barrel of rum every year until he died. So,
oh wow, it's amazing. And we actually have a really interesting connection. I just saw Rosalind, a friend of mine and amazing symphony supporter, says Jamaican rumba was written for her mother and her sister, the Trimble sisters piano duo in London, who had been piano students of Arthur Benjamin, their teacher at Royal College of Music. So that's amazing.
Oh,
so cool.
Wonderful.
And I know I was talking to our principal violist earlier today, Meredith Crawford, and she's a huge fan of this piece too. So very exciting to get to see. So this is Paul Huang and Helen Huang playing Jamaican Rumba by Walter Benjamin. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you must be very busy, even in quarantine pandemic time. It's always such a treat to have you come play with the symphony, and I'm just so appreciative you'd come, spend this hour chatting with me.
Thank you for having me. It's really, really wonderful to see you, and then to get to talk to your supporters and friends of the symphony, because I really miss playing with all of you. One of my favorite orchestras, and I say that very, very genuinely.
Well, that's very kind. And, we're just so excited to get back to normal life and have you come back many times. So
absolutely,
Jamaican Rumba,
can't wait.
Yeah, us too. Jamaican Rumba, Walter Benjamin. For everybody who's been enjoying these symphony mixers the last few months, this is something that we as a symphony love to offer as a you know, a free way of keeping in touch with everybody. And it's so meaningful for me personally to get to share these hours with you all every week. They are free. You might have noticed in the chat at the beginning, there is a link if you've been enjoying these and feel like you can and would like to support the symphony. We encourage you to go to pacificsymphony.org/donate. And we could probably get that link back in the chat also. So that any support would be greatly appreciated. So without further ado, Jamaican Rumba. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody. Bravo, Paul. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.